This podcast is about you. Are you ready? Take a moment and ask yourself, do I know the truth, and do I even care? Well, if you care at all, we have something for you. Stick around. We're a podcast that does not ignore the truth about life, people, or God. Larry Kutzler has been a pastor, a Bible commentator, a radio and podcast producer, and now is your host. This is a podcast you won't forget.
I have a text tonight which is a question, and it's a question that we cannot answer collectively. It's a question you have to answer individually. It's found in the very practical epistle, as it's usually called, the Epistle of James, in the 4th chapter and verse 14. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time, and then it vanisheth away. You will never face a more challenging question than this text. What is your life? So there are three basic questions about life. Where did it come from? Why am I here? And where do I go from here? Now, if this book is about anything at all, it's about life. You see, the question here is very pointed, and maybe it's very personal. It is impersonal, maybe it's very painful. Maybe you could answer the question, what is your life? You say it's a failure. What is your life? A success. What is your life? It's a disappointment. But actually, it's showing to us, by the very context, that life is like a vapor. It's like the steam that comes off the kettle, and you try and get a handful of it and it's gone. And yet tonight, with all our progressive education, we have more sin, we have more darkness, we have more slums, we have more disease, we have more broken homes, more broken lives. The world is a madhouse. You know, we learn from history. The one thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. If we did, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in tonight. Now, do you remember his great statement? I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the way, without that there's no going. I am the truth, without that there's no knowing. I am the life, without him there's no growing. I am the way, that's external. I am the truth, that's internal. I am the life, that's eternal. But the whole thing is about life. We have a space within us, and God made us for himself, and we'll never ever be satisfied until he comes and occupies that part in our lives.
The Bible teaches us how to live, how to treat others, and what to expect when life is over. Nothing compares to its claims of living with God forever, and we're here to tell you more. Thanks for joining us.
Transformation is a word that defines my guest today. The word means a thorough or dramatic change, and that certainly describes Michael Kylochko. Personal transformation, of course, is also defined as how we change aspects of who we are, what we do, and how we lead. And Michael was a client at one time at Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge, and today he is the Senior Manager of Operations at the Brainerd Adult and Teen Challenge. I'm excited to talk to you, Michael, because I love talking to people who have a transformation story, and you definitely do. So tell me a little bit, just briefly, what's your story?
My story really is, if I look back, finding a place to belong. That's kind of been the common thread. You know, from the time I was a kid, I really wanted to be involved in what my family was doing. I come from a very loving family from the Iron Range originally, south of Hibbing, and one common thread in all our family gatherings was drinking. Very common there, and some could handle it, some couldn't, but that was the norm that I saw, was to have a good time, you had to have a drink in your hand. And so I remember from a very young age, wanting to sneak beers and wanting to fit in that way. And I found my sense of belonging through that at a very young age. One other thing that happened a lot, my dad was a manager at a rental equipment company, and as he was promoted, we moved around a lot too. And so I was always looking for that new set of friends, a new group of people to fit into. But I suppose probably around the age of 12 or 13, we had moved again, and we ended up moving down to Monticello, Minnesota. And I ended up finding some friends there, and the majority of those friends were already smoking weed and drinking and doing things like that. So I kind of just fit in with that crowd there. And I found the people that I thought I had belonged with. I was very good at making friends. I was very good at kind of just excelled in the chemical use when I did that. It made me feel comfortable. It made me feel like there was a connection point through that. And I had access to beer and booze that I could take from my dad and his liquor cabinet. And I had an older sibling, and I was able to get other things that I needed too. And so that was kind of my story from a pretty young age of just doing what I needed to do to fit in. I excelled in school. I had straight A's straight through school until my senior year when I stopped going. And so the chemicals really didn't affect me that way, but I started to see the effects of how it was affecting my family. I remember I was probably 17 the first time someone called me an alcoholic. I kind of laughed it off, but inside I was starting to question whether that was true or not. Shortly after that I had met my high school sweetheart, and that relationship, looking back, was really centered around the party lifestyle. Of course, we were madly in love and doing all the things that go along with that. And by the time I was 18 and just had started college, I found out that she was pregnant with my first child, my sweet Natasha. And I really wanted to do something different. At that point in my life, I decided, okay, I need to quit drinking, quit using drugs. And I decided to do that. And I did for a little while because I wanted to be a good dad. But it didn't take long after she was born for me to start having a few beers here and there and really getting back into a full-fledged addiction shortly after that. One thing that is also a big part of my family is music. I come from a very musical family. My fondest memories from childhood are sitting around the campfire with my grandpa and dad and uncles and playing music and singing songs. And so I had that musical bug, and I was in a band and, playing in bars and all the lifestyle that goes along with that, while trying to be a dad to this young little girl, while trying to be, at this point, we had gotten married, to be a husband. Really couldn't handle it. And it led to infidelity on my part, and just a series of things in my life that really brought me into a dark depression, drove my wife into her own addiction and all the mess that went along with that. I decided that that's not how I wanted to live anymore, but I really didn't know how to change. I went to treatment. I had already been to treatment at this time a couple times. I went into treatment. I did all the AA. I got all the information that I could, and I was really set on being sober. But once I got out of that treatment environment, I went right back to my addiction. At this point, I had lost any sort of hope that I might have had of being, living a normal life, whatever that might be, being a dad, being a husband, having a good job. And I just kind of dove headfirst into a deeper addiction to methamphetamines at that point. I had met a girl who, that was her drug of choice, and we kind of went off the deep end together. And that, led to 10 years of utter chaos, where I did a whole lot of things that I'm not very proud of to support my addiction. I was an IV meth addict. I sold drugs. I robbed people. I burglarized places, and ended up doing just a lot of things that I'm definitely not proud of today. But it was from the depths of that, God started to weave together a plan of redemption. I had gotten to a point in my addiction where it was very dark. When I'd get to a point in my addiction where things were not that good, I would go to treatment. I would get sober for 30 days and think everything would be okay. And I attempted to do that. I put myself into treatment. And while I was at a treatment center, I found out I was getting indicted on a felony burglary ring for all these things I was involved in. I was flashing across the WCCO news headlines. That's how I found out. And so I was in a world of panic, a world of anxiety, in a world of hopelessness. And man, that's where kind of my journey with the Lord began. I met a few people in that treatment center that had similar things going on, but they had peace. They had joy. They were able to laugh. I asked them, what gives? What's going on? And that's where this young man told me about the person of Jesus Christ. He shared the hope that he had, and he led me through a prayer. And I don't know what happened that day. Unfortunately, I didn't really start being obedient to Jesus at that point. But from that point, I could see how God was working in and through my life. I went back into my addiction for a couple more years. My choices landed me up in prison, but that's really where I fell in love with the Word of God. I read the Bible cover to cover a couple times in there, started getting involved in the church in there, and started to get a sense of that belonging that I had looked for. But part of that too, I wasn't fully ready to surrender to what God had. I was one way in the church services in prison, and I was another way on the yard in prison. And so I was living this double life in there. So after I got out, I was really set on being sober and doing the right thing, but I didn't have a strong community. And after I got to see my children when they went back to their moms, I didn't know how to handle the pain of that. And I ended up relapsing, went into a psychosis, and ended up in a locked psych ward for a while. I think because I had started to taste and see the things of God when I went backwards. He took his hand off for a second and said, "Here you go, son. This is what you're stepping into if you continue." I remember taking an ambulance ride from Hibbing, Minnesota down to South Minneapolis to the U of M, Fairview Mental Institute down there. And I got there early in the morning, maybe 2, 3 in the morning, and I asked to see a chaplain. One of the things that I had learned in prison was that two believers could come into agreement in prayer, and God could really move through that. So I asked for the chaplain, and I said, we got to come into agreement that something good comes out of this mess. And Larry, at that time, I experienced peace again like I hadn't felt in a long time. I went to bed, I slept, I woke up in the morning, got a hold of my parole officer because I was on parole at this time, and told him what had happened. And he was grateful that I was honest. And he said, I want you to stay put until we can get you into somewhere for some treatment. And the social worker at the hospital said, what about Teen Challenge? And I'm like, oh, I'm willing to try anything at this point. I'd heard about Teen Challenge and my addiction, and it was always one of those things where you're like, I don't know, that's a little weird for me. It kind of has a reputation as a cult, but I think it's because it actually works, and people that are stuck in their addiction until they're actually ready to change don't want to make that choice. So I did. I got into Teen Challenge. I started in Minneapolis and transferred to the Brainerd campus because my younger children were living in Crosby at the time. And boy, I tell you, I walked through the front doors and I just experienced the love of God in a tangible way. You know, I made a decision at that point with some encouragement from people around me that I needed to be all in. And I decided to be all in, and I haven't looked back since then. I've learned to apply the word to my life, to be obedient, to serve others. And that's what I've been doing. I graduated our 13-month long-term program, went through our year-long ministry school in the cities that we have, came back to work for Teen Challenge. I've been working here for a little over 6 years now. Started as an intern and then a recovery coach, and was our aftercare coordinator. And like you had mentioned, have been recently promoted to our senior manager of operations. You know, that's what God can do in a life submitted to him. And man, there's miracle after miracle in that journey, in that story, and man, learning to fit in.
This is why I love transformation. I mean, you came in as a client and you end up running the place. Now, that's Joseph's story, right? I attend the same church you do, and our pastor has been talking about Joseph. You're a living Joseph. You really are. And I watch you lead worship on Sunday morning from time to time. I think it's great. So, Michael, let's just unpack this just a little bit more. You said originally that you were in a loving family, you know, a good family. Yeah, they drank and they did this and did that, but they were good. What was it in that family you were missing?
I think the thing that was missing, looking back, for me, was that personal relationship with Jesus Christ. You know, my family, actually, they brought us to church here and there when I was a kid. I think my mom was raised the same ways, and they went to church with their parents. I actually found out later on in life that my great-grandpa was a pastor at the turn of the century. But I think having that relationship and living in the Word, like I don't ever remember hearing about the person of Jesus Christ. I remember going to church and going through the motions, but I don't remember hearing about the gospel really. And so for me, I think that was that sense of longing. Like, and I still love my family. They're a very loving family and do well by the world standards, but in some are believers and some are not. But I think that was the missing piece for me, was that relationship with Christ.
Well, I was raised on the Iron Range as well. I didn't hear about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ until I was 20 and I was a drug addict. You know, I had a colleague that went through 15 programs, drug programs, and never got clean until he came to Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge. And now he works for them like you do. It's incredible. But there's that missing piece in all addiction programs, I feel, is the person of Jesus Christ. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, as well-intentioned as most programs are, I think there is that missing spiritual component that is really, I think, necessary. We need to know and understand. We need to get physical healing in our bodies. But for me, and I think for most, there's that God-sized hole in our heart that we were trying to fill with whatever we could. And for some of us, that was chemicals. For some in the world, that's money. For some in the world, that's sex. for me, for sure, it was chemicals and alcohol. And once I found that spiritual component, that's where I started to live a life that was different, because I too had been to multiple treatments. If you look at the roots of the 12 steps in AA, it's a spiritual program based off the scriptures. They knew it was about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Bill W. saw the risen Christ at the foot of his bed and started AA after that. And so I think many have gotten away from that, but that's the foundation, and it always has been. And that's why I think we see a difference here at Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge.
Well, I love the program. I always tell people, Michael, that if you really want to see church in its fullest and transformative ways, attend a chapel service at one of the Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge centers. As a pastor now for 30, 40 years, I realize that transformation is so important, because you can talk all you want about the principles of Scripture, but if you don't see people changed and transformation take place, I sometimes wonder, what are we really doing with the gospel? But when I read about Jesus, he preached, he taught, and then there was transformation following that. He healed people, cast out demons. I mean, he did something that made people's lives different. And that's why I love people like yourself and the program, because you are making a difference in people's lives. Now, Michael, as you're dealing with addicts all day long, they're coming in and going out of the program, graduating, so forth. I mean, what are your thoughts sometimes? Do you think about, gee, I was there one time, and you have empathy? Certainly empathy, because you understand it, right?
Well, and ideally, I have that empathy. There's some days, if I'm honest, where I can be cranky and say, man, what's wrong with you guys? And I can forget where I was when I'm living in the moment. And so, I'm really grateful that I get to work with addicts that are seeking something different, because it reminds me of where I was and some of the miracles that the Lord has done, but also just the warnings of how easy it could be to go backwards if I made a couple poor choices.
Well, we talk about the spiritual transformation, but I know, Michael, when I came to Christ, I all of a sudden discovered there were a lot of other gifts in me that I had never known about. God brought me into reading and writing and actually being a carpenter for a while. I learned skills. Did you discover any of that yourself, that aside from your spiritual journey, there were things that God created you to be, and all of a sudden you go, aha.
Yeah, well, music for sure. God has really redeemed that part of my life. I guess probably the biggest thing that there was a longing for and I had given up hope on was being a dad, being a good dad. Still, I get choked up when I think about it and think about what God has done in restoring the relationship with my kids. Altogether, I have 6 children, with between 4 of my own and 2 bonus kiddos from marriage. And I have a relationship with each one of them. They've had their own hurts over the years, a lot of because of my choices. And so we're still working through that. But God has shown me that he's given me what I need to be a dad to them, ultimately to help point them to his love, but just to be there relationally too. And so that's one of the bigger gifts that I've had. The other thing, I believe God's given me a physical body to use. I love to run. I've ran a handful of marathons. I'm part of some running groups where we go out and just build relationship. So that's another gift that I think God has shown me through recovery too, is just to enjoy my physical body in ways that like that.
Well, that's great. And one of the critical issues in America today is fatherless homes. Your desire to be a good dad is an admirable ambition, and we need good dads that understand God, understand the principles of relationship and forgiveness and healing. I mean, that's very important. Well, last but not least, Michael, I'm curious what you would say to our audience today who perhaps have addicted loved ones or friends or relatives. What would you say to them who are facing these kinds of issues with people that are trapped by addiction? What do you say to them?
Well, Larry, I'd say to them, don't lose hope. I got to the lowest of lows. I've been written off as hopeless. I have a mental health diagnosis that is a mile long, a criminal record that's equally as long, and had been called every label under the sun. But I started to get hope. And that's really what changed things in my life. And I think that, and this too, that true hope is found in the person of Jesus Christ and a relationship through that. And so don't lose hope. Don't lose hope for yourself. Don't lose hope for your family members that are struggling. There's love beyond the love that you carry that can help them. and just to continue to show them that addicts are broken people that need love. Most are more than aware of the destruction of their behavior. They're more than aware that the things that they're doing are wrong, that the things that they're doing hurt other people. They don't need to be reminded of that constantly. They need to be reminded that they have love and they have a purpose beyond that addiction, beyond what they've been doing with their life. And they need people, godly men and women, to help them along that journey.
Well, Michael Kylochko, thank you. In fact, I'm going to rename you. Is that okay? I mean,
Maybe.
There were a lot of people in the Bible that got renamed. So here's what I'm going to rename you. Mr. Transformation. How's that? I love it, Michael. Thank you so much. I mean, this has been really a rich conversation about how God has changed your life. And if anybody's struggling, again, with any kind of addiction, Minnesota Adult Teen Challenge is available. What do people do? Can they call up, walk in?
The best bet is 612-FREEDOM. That's our number across the state. No matter where you are in the state of Minnesota, we can get you help. Our goal is to bring hope within reach of every Minnesotan. And so that's the first place. You can also go to mntc.org, and there's links to get an assessment, which is basically the first step to get you into the doors.
This podcast is not about how palatable Christianity can be. It's about how dangerous its message is to our world. The scripture tells us that Jesus came to bring a sword and a fire so he would distinguish his message. The gospel message of Jesus Christ is a dangerous message because it sets people free. That message is our goal for this podcast.
This isn't the end. It's only the beginning of your journey to trust God for the truth you never want to lose. We can help. Log on to citysitesurbanmedia.com today. Remember, there's only one truth and only one God, and you should know them both.